2 Samuel, I just opened it up. 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 14, Atonement. Death is required. Oftentimes, the life of a follower of Jesus demands something radical. God's standard for his people is perfection. He requires absolute surrender. However, no one is able to live up to that standard, which is what makes God's restorative work throughout Scripture such a miracle. When God restores people to a right relationship with himself, he removes the barrier that sin creates between himself and humanity. This is a radical thought. God's standard perfection is not just overwhelming, it is impossible. In this passage, the Gibeonites asked for an outrageous payment from David to atone for Saul's sins against them, but in the New Testament, Jesus becomes the once and for all payment for the sin of humanity. No longer would individual sin require individual and unique sacrifices, but Jesus covers all sin, past, present, and future. There is nothing more radical than a perfect man dying once and for all for humanity's indiscretions and failures. 2 Samuel 22, 1 through 51, Head of Nations. According to verse 1 of this chapter, David wrote this song of praise as he reflected on how God had delivered him from his enemies. After years of hardship at the hands of various enemies, whether it was an unjust envy of Saul or the warring Philistines, David now experienced peace and authored this song, having seen the evidence that God was his rock, fortress, and deliverer, although generated out of the personal deliverance experience of David. This song was included in the book of Psalms 18, because it has broader applications for those who experience God's love and protection. Also noteworthy are the parts of this song that speak of David as the head of nations. In a limited sense, this applied to David in his day, but it would apply ultimately to Jesus as discussed in 2 Samuel 7. David closes the song of praise by highlighting God's faithfulness to him and his descendants forever. Clearly, God had faithfully honored his promise to David by preserving his place as the head of nations, a promise that David remembered and was applied to Jesus in Luke 1:32 through 33. Job 23 through 9. When the wicked thrive. Zophar attempted to sidestep Job's rebuke with the caustic reminder that evil people only thrive and succeed for a little while. His skewed perspective led him to the conclusion that Job's suffering was the natural consequence of a wicked life exposed at last. Jesus presented a contrasting view that reminds believers to keep an eternal perspective on reward and judgment, while Scripture assures that the wicked will receive a just punishment for their defiance and rejection of the Lord. Often that verdict does not come until the end of this earthly life. Often that verdict does not come until the end of this earthly life. God's judgment is not hasty, but he promises an eventual day when he will separate good from evil. While waiting for justice to be served, it is tempting to suppose that the abundance of the unrighteous person is a sign of God's lack of justice. In reality, the delay in judgment is an expression of God's abundant patience and grace, granting unbelievers more time to respond to the mercy and forgiveness extended to them through Jesus Christ. My Redeemer lives. Job 19:25 through 27. Job's belief in God is amazing. Even more striking is how God allowed Job to get to the place where he could trust in God. Even though his circumstances looked hopeless, God delivered Job not from his sufferings, but through his sufferings. In the midst of battling his ignorant friends, something clicked. Through his resistance against bad advice from friends, and through his persistent battle for belief, a new insight emerged. Job was able to confess and believe that God was with him. When faced with intense pain, God's people may not learn God's people may not learn why, as much as they have come to know who. Job never received answers to all of his questions. What he really needed to learn was the guide as to who he could depend on. In life, there is so much that happens that cannot be explained. In the midst of life's uncertainties, God knows what people need. Jesus is holding on to his people, and this relationship allows them to endure to the end. God was not risking Job's faith, God was refining his faith. Only when everything is stripped away can a person evaluate what truly matters. After suffering unimaginable loss, Job was able to confess, after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. Oftentimes, God's people do not learn that God is all they need until God is all they have. Without God, this life and the Without God, this life and the eternity that follows will be full of pain. But when someone trusts in Jesus Christ, God promises that all the sad things will one day be healed and redeemed. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. According to his purpose. Romans 8:28. Job's faith in the midst of this fight is a model for life. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Hebrews 11:6. When people put their faith in Jesus, they can have hope that the way things are in the world is not the way they will always be. Suffering and pain can be seen as temporary in light of eternity with Jesus. I hear a rebuke that dishonors me, and my understanding inspires me to reply. Surely you know how it has been from of old, ever since mankind was placed on the earth, that the mirth of the wicked is brief. The joy of the godless lasts but a moment. Through the pride of the godless person reaches to the heavens, and his head touches the clouds, he will perish forever, like his own dung. Those who have seen him will say, where is he? Like a dream he flies away, no more to be found, vanished like a vision of the night. The eye that saw him will not see him again. His place will look on him no more.